Most people will never be clever, not because they aren't smart enough, but because they confuse the two things their entire life and spent decades developing the wrong one. Smart is what school measures. Smart is scores and recall and the ability to reproduce what someone else already figured out. Smart is useful. Smart gets you in the room. But clever, real cleverness, the kind that makes people slightly nervous around you, the kind that makes things happen that shouldn't be able to happen given your resources, your position, your access, that's an entirely different animal. And nobody teaches it. Nobody grades it. Nobody even talks about it honestly, because the people who have it would rather you didn't. Niccolo Machiavelli had it, and he was so precise in documenting how it works that 500 years later, his name is still used as an adjective for a specific kind of dangerously effective thinking that most people can't quite define, but immediately recognize when they're on the receiving end of it. What I'm about to walk you through are 11 principles extracted from Machiavelli's thinking that form a complete blueprint for developing this quality. Not cleverness as a party trick. Not cleverness as manipulation for its own sake. Cleverness as a fundamental upgrade to how you process reality, navigate people, and position yourself in any environment you operate in. This is going to get uncomfortable in places. Good. Comfortable thinking produces predictable results. Let's begin. Principle 1. See the world as it is, not as you were taught it should be. This sounds almost insultingly simple until you actually try to do it consistently and discover how violently your own mind resists it. We are all, without exception, operating inside a picture of the world that was handed to us before we were old enough to evaluate it. A picture assembled from the beliefs of our parents, the incentives of our education system, the values of the culture we grew up inside, and the specific experiences that happened to land hardest in our formative years. That picture feels like reality. It isn't. It's a map. And like any map, it has errors, outdated information, and entire territories it simply doesn't include. Machiavelli's entire intellectual project began with one decision: to look at political reality as it actually functioned, rather than as centuries of received wisdom said it should function. What he saw when he did that was so different from the official picture that the book he wrote about it got banned, burned, and placed on the Catholic Church's index of forbidden texts. Not because it was wrong, because it was right in ways that were profoundly inconvenient for people who benefited from everyone else believing the official picture. The first move toward dangerous cleverness is developing the habit of asking, not what am I supposed to think about this, but what is actually true about this when I look at it directly. These are not always different questions. Sometimes the received wisdom is accurate, but you will never know which times those are until you've developed the practice of checking rather than assuming. Most people never check. They inherit a map and spend their entire lives navigating by it, wondering why they keep arriving at destinations they didn't choose. Principle 2. Understand that people are moved by interest, not by argument. This one will save you an enormous amount of wasted energy if you actually internalize it. Machiavelli observed, with the kind of calm that only comes from watching enough human behavior to stop being surprised by it, that people almost never change their position because of logic. They change their position when their interests shift, when the cost-benefit calculation changes, when what they stand to gain or lose from a particular belief or behavior changes enough to make movement feel worth it. This doesn't mean people are purely selfish in some crude sense. Interests include emotional ones. Interests include identity, belonging, status, the need to feel consistent with who they believe themselves to be. But those are still interests. They're still the actual engine-driving behavior, regardless of what the person tells you, and often regardless of what they tell themselves. The practically clever person stops trying to win arguments and starts asking a different question entirely. Not, how do I prove I'm right? but what would have to be true about this person's interests for my position to become the one they want to adopt? That reframe alone changes everything about how you communicate, how you negotiate, how you lead, and how you resolve conflict. You are not in the business of being right. You are in the business of being effective. And effectiveness with humans almost always runs through their interests, not through your logic. Before we go further, I need to say something, and I'm going to say it straight. YouTube recently stripped away every way I could monetize my work because they like to reward flashy cuts and dopamine hits over anything that actually makes you think. So I left. Not completely, but the real work, the slow, methodical, raw version of everything I do here, lives on Patreon now, where no algorithm decides what's too honest to show you, where I don't have to make philosophy suitable for an insurance ad. So click the link in the description or the pinned comment and join the movement. Principle 3. Never reveal the full extent of your capability. There's a specific kind of power that lives in the gap between what people think you can do and what you can actually do. Machiavelli understood this gap as strategic real estate. The wider it is, the more options you have. The moment someone has fully mapped your capabilities, they can plan around them. They can prepare for you. They can calculate exactly what you're able to bring to bear and position themselves accordingly. But when they're not sure, when they sense there might be more there than they've seen, that uncertainty changes how they behave around you. It introduces a caution, a deference, a slight hesitation before they act against you that can be worth more than any specific capability you actually possess. This isn't about being deceptive in a way that damages trust. It's about understanding that not everything needs to be demonstrated and not every strength needs to be announced. The person who walks into every room and immediately establishes exactly what they know and what they can do has handed away something valuable for nothing in return. Let people wonder. Let them suspect there's more. Let the gap work for you. Principle 4. Move in silence, especially when it matters most. Machiavelli was almost obsessive on this point, and the reason becomes obvious when you trace the specific failures he was analyzing. Rulers who announced their intentions in advance gave their opposition the one thing it needed most, which was time to prepare. Time to build counter-alliances. Time to shore up defenses. Time to position against the coming move. The announcement itself was what made the move fail, not the move. There is a particular modern version of this failure that is worth naming directly because it's everywhere. It's the person who talks extensively about what they're going to do as a substitute for actually doing it. The announcement creates a small social reward, attention, admiration, the feeling of being taken seriously. And that reward bleeds off enough of the psychological pressure that the actual execution never quite happens with full force. You've already gotten some of what you wanted from saying you were going to do the thing. Doing the thing becomes less urgent. Machiavelli would find this baffling and then immediately recognize it as a structural weakness to exploit in others. Do the thing. Then talk about it if you must. But understand that every word you say about your intentions in advance is a tax on the effectiveness of the action that follows. Principle 5. Cultivate the ability to sit with uncertainty without flinching. This is one of the less obvious ones, but in practice it might be the most differentiating. The capacity to remain clear-headed and functional inside genuine uncertainty without forcing a premature resolution just to relieve the discomfort is extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily valuable. Most people can't do it. The ambiguity becomes so uncomfortable that they collapse it too early. They make a decision not because the right answer has become clear, but because any answer feels better than continued uncertainty. And that premature closure costs them badly because they've resolved the feeling of not knowing without actually gaining the knowledge that would have made the decision a good one. Machiavelli watched this constantly. Rulers who committed too early because waiting felt weak, who chose a side before the situation had fully revealed itself because neutrality felt exposed, who locked in a strategy before enough information had come in because the uncertainty of an open question was more unbearable to them than the risk of a wrong answer. The dangerously clever mind treats uncertainty differently. It learns to stay inside the open question, to keep gathering, to resist the pull toward premature resolution, to understand that discomfort is not danger and that waiting for genuine clarity when the situation genuinely warrants waiting is not weakness but precision. Principle 6. Always know what the other person needs to believe in order to feel like they won. This is where Machiavelli's thinking becomes almost surgical. He wasn't interested in dominating people in ways that made them feel dominated. That produces resentment, which produces future problems. He was interested in outcomes that left the other person feeling satisfied with their position, even when the actual outcome had been shaped entirely to his advantage. This requires genuine understanding of the other person, not surface-level reading. Deep understanding of what they value, what they're afraid of losing, what they need to be able to tell themselves and their allies about how this went. When you have that understanding, you can frequently structure outcomes that give you what you actually need, while giving them what they need to feel okay about it. This is not manipulation in the pejorative sense. It's sophisticated. It's the difference between winning in a way that creates an enemy and winning in a way that creates a future ally. Machiavelli consistently preferred the second, not out of sentimentality, but because enemies are expensive and the world is long. Principle 7. Let others underestimate the effort behind your results. Effortlessness is its own form of power. When your results appear to arrive without visible strain, without public struggle, without the performance of hard work that most people feel compelled to broadcast, it creates a particular impression in the minds of observers. It suggests reserves. It suggests that what they've seen is not your ceiling, but somewhere comfortably below it. It makes you harder to measure and therefore harder to compete with. Machiavelli admired rulers who made governance look natural, who moved through complexity without showing the seams. Not because the difficulty wasn't real, but because broadcasting it would have invited challenges from people who might otherwise have assumed the difficulty was beyond them. There's real discipline required here, because the impulse to have your efforts seen and recognized is genuinely human and not entirely without value. But there's a time and a place. And in competitive environments, in environments where you are being assessed and measured and compared, the strategic choice is almost always to let the results speak and keep the effort private. Principle 8. Never make permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. Machiavelli documented this failure more than almost any other because the consequences were so consistently catastrophic. A ruler insulted at a dinner table who made an enemy of someone he needed as an ally 6 months later. A negotiation poisoned by pride at a moment when generosity would have produced a far better long-term outcome. An alliance broken in a moment of anger that took years to rebuild, if it was rebuilt at all. Emotions are real, and they carry real information. Anger usually means a boundary has been crossed. Fear usually means a genuine risk is present. But the information they carry needs to be processed with a cooler part of your mind before it becomes action. Because the action that feels most satisfying in the emotional moment is almost never the action that produces the best outcome when you look at the full board. The practice here is simple to describe and genuinely hard to execute. When the emotional charge is high, extend the gap between feeling and action. Not indefinitely, not as avoidance, but long enough for the signal to be heard and the noise to dissipate. Then decide. Then act. You will be wrong less often in ways that matter. Principle 9. Build patterns of behavior that make you predictable where it benefits you and unpredictable where it doesn't. This is a nuanced one that takes a minute to land properly. Machiavelli wasn't advocating for pure unpredictability across the board. That produces anxiety in allies and instability in systems that depend on trust. What he was advocating for was selective predictability, being entirely reliable on the dimensions where reliability builds your reputation and your relationships, and entirely unreadable on the dimensions where predictability would allow people to plan against you. In practical terms, this means being the person everyone can count on to show up, to follow through, to treat people with consistency and fairness. That reputation is an asset, but simultaneously being the person nobody can quite anticipate on questions of strategy, direction, and response to opposition. The combination is powerful because it means you are trusted, and trusted people are given access, but you are not mapped, and unmapped people cannot be countered. Principle 11. Become the kind of person whose presence changes the calculation. This is where all 10 previous principles converge into something that's less a tactic and more a way of being. Machiavelli's highest conception of the dangerous and capable mind wasn't someone who deployed clever moves in specific situations. It was someone whose overall presence in any situation changed what was possible in that situation, who made allies more ambitious, opponents more cautious, and observers more attentive simply by being there and being known as what they were. That quality doesn't come from any single skill or any single principle. It comes from the accumulation of all of them, practiced consistently, over enough time that they stop being things you do and become things you are. The clarity of perception becomes natural. The discipline around timing becomes instinctive. The ability to read people's interests runs in the background without conscious effort. The strategic patience stops feeling like restraint and starts feeling like confidence. And this process, the conversion of conscious practice into unconscious competence, is not fast. That needs to be said plainly because most content about strategic thinking skips this part and leaves people feeling like they should already be operating at a level they haven't had the time to build toward yet. Machiavelli himself spent 15 years inside the Florentine government before he wrote a single word of The Prince. 15 years of watching, testing, failing, adjusting, watching again. The book wasn't inspiration. It was sediment. Everything that accumulated from sustained exposure to how power actually moves between actual human beings in actual high-stakes situations. Which means the question isn't whether you're clever enough to apply these principles. You probably are. The question is whether you're patient enough, whether you're willing to practice them in the small situations, the low-stakes rooms, the everyday negotiations and conversations and decisions, with the same seriousness you'd bring to the moments that feel important. Because the moments that feel important almost never announce themselves in advance. They arrive without warning, and they demand a version of you that either exists or doesn't. You cannot build that version in the moment. You can only reveal it. There's something else worth saying about what this kind of development actually feels like from the inside, because Machiavelli touched on it in his letters in a way that rarely gets discussed. It doesn't feel like accumulating power in the way most people imagine. It feels more like accumulated clarity, like slowly having a set of lenses corrected until the world stops being blurry in the ways it used to be blurry. You start to see the structure underneath conversations. You start to feel the shift in a room before it becomes visible. You start to notice the thing people are not saying as clearly as the thing they are. And you start to understand that the gap between those two things is where almost all of the real information lives. That's not a superpower. It's a trained sensitivity. And like any trained sensitivity, once developed, you cannot turn it off. You will walk into rooms you used to walk into blindly and see them completely differently. You will have conversations you used to have reactively and feel yourself operating 3 beats ahead of where you used to be. Not because the room changed or the conversation changed, because you did. And here is the thing about Machiavelli that most people miss entirely when they reduce him to a handbook for cynical maneuvering. He believed, genuinely and deeply, that this quality of mind, this dangerous cleverness, this precisely directed human capability was not just strategically superior to the alternative. It was more fully human. The unexamined, reactive, fog-bound mind doesn't just produce worse outcomes. It experiences less. It participates less fully in its own life. It is moved by forces it doesn't understand toward destinations it didn't choose, and it calls that fate. Machiavelli called it something else. He called it a waste. And sitting in that farmhouse in San Casciano, stripped of his titles and his salary and his access to the corridors of power, he'd spent his adult life inside. What he chose to do with that waste, with that enforced stillness, was think. More carefully and more honestly than he ever had when he was busy being important. And what came out of that thinking was a body of work that has outlasted every single ruler he ever advised, every government he ever served, every political structure he ever operated inside. The circumstances that feel like they're ending something are sometimes the ones that make the most important things possible. That's not consolation. That's pattern recognition. And pattern recognition, applied honestly and consistently to your own life, is where dangerous cleverness ultimately begins and ends. 11 principles. One underlying idea. The mind that sees clearly, moves precisely, and understands people as they actually are, rather than as it wishes they were, is the most dangerous thing in any room it enters. Not dangerous to others necessarily, dangerous to mediocrity, dangerous to the comfortable illusions that keep most people exactly where they are, dangerous to the version of yourself that has been operating below what you're actually capable of for longer than you'd like to admit. That's the version of dangerous worth becoming. Start with principle 1, the rest follows. Most content out here is designed to make you feel informed without actually changing anything. When I tried to make that change, they did everything in their power to stop me. But instead of giving up, I did what Machiavelli taught: adapt to the times, not complain about them. The real work now lives on Patreon. But I can't build this alone. If you believe in what I'm creating and want to help keep it alive, join me there.